The John Wayne mystery is finally solved, and it isn't good. For more than half a century, John Wayne stood as the ultimate American hero. The Duke, towering, tough, and true. A celluloid cowboy whose very name became synonymous with rugged American masculinity. His walk, his talk, that distinctive drawl telling audiences that everything would be all right if you just stood your ground and fought for what's right. But behind that carefully constructed image lurked a far more complex and often troubling reality that Hollywood executives, publicists, and even Wayne himself worked tirelessly to keep hidden from his adoring public now. Decades after his death, the carefully maintained facade has finally begun to crumble, revealing truths about the man that stand in stark contrast to the legend millions of fans believed in. The gap between John Wayne the man and John Wayne the icon might be the biggest deception in Hollywood history, revealed a longtime studio executive who worked with Wayne on several films in the 1960s. What fans saw on screen was a carefully manufactured product, not the real Marion Morrison. Indeed, the man-born Marion Robert Morrison in Winterset, Iowa, underwent one of the most comprehensive image makeovers in entertainment history. Studio heads didn't just change his name, they rewrote his entire persona, creating a heroic alter ego that, according to those closest to him, often bore little resemblance to the man they knew off-camera. Perhaps most shocking are the revelations about Wayne's loudly proclaimed patriotism, a cornerstone of his public image that helped him become one of the most beloved figures in American popular culture. While he built a career playing courageous soldiers and war heroes, the reality of his own military service, or lack thereof, paints a very different picture than the one he portrayed in countless interviews. He made millions playing brave men in uniform, confided a fellow actor who worked alongside Wayne in several war films. But when America needed real heroes, John Wayne made sure he was safely on a Hollywood set rather than a battlefield. That knowledge haunted him more than the public ever knew. Even more disturbing are the recently unearthed private comments that reveal views dramatically at odds with the all-American, fair-minded hero he portrayed on screen, views so controversial that studios spent decades working to ensure they remained hidden from his devoted fans. And then there's the story of his final days, a tragic end that bore no resemblance to the dignified deaths his characters often faced on screen. According to those who were there, the reality of John Wayne's last weeks was far more devastating than the public has ever been told. Today, we're finally solving the mystery behind one of Hollywood's most enduring icons, pulling back the curtain on the man behind the myth to reveal the startling truth about the Duke that changes everything we thought we knew about America's most famous cowboy.
Now, what did you say?
I said, any of you want to surrender?
Doomed from the start, his cowboy image was manufactured and often fake. John Wayne's transformation from Marion Morrison to the Duke represents one of the most comprehensive personality makeovers in entertainment history. The tall, awkward young man who initially failed as a football player at USC found himself reinvented by the Hollywood studio system, not just with a new name, but with an entirely new persona carefully crafted to embody an idealized version of American manhood. Marion Morrison was given John Wayne as a name, but more importantly, he was given an entire character to play, both on and off screen, explained film historian Barbara Wilkins. Early in his career, studio executives and publicists literally handed him a script for his public life that included not just his biographical details, but how he should walk, talk, and present himself to fans. It was a performance that never stopped, even when the cameras weren't rolling. This manufactured image was built around several core elements, most notably a rugged patriotism and unflinching courage that became central to Wayne's appeal. In films like The Sands of Iwo Jima, The Green Berets, and countless westerns, Wayne portrayed men who never hesitated to fight for their country or their principles, who faced danger without flinching. Yet according to multiple sources close to the actor, this cornerstone of Wayne's persona stood in stark contrast to one of the most carefully guarded secrets of his actual life, his deliberate avoidance of military service during World War II. While contemporaries like Jimmy Stewart, Clark Gable, and Henry Fonda enlisted and served, some seeing actual combat, Wayne secured a 3A deferment, designated for family support, despite being in perfect physical condition, 34 years old, and having only dependent children rather than a hardship case. As millions of American men his age faced the horrors of war, Wayne remained in Hollywood, making films and advancing his career. He built his reputation playing military heroes while taking active steps to avoid becoming one himself, noted military historian Robert Thompson. What's particularly striking is that after the war, rather than quietly moving past this chapter, Wayne began amplifying his patriotic persona, becoming increasingly vocal about American military might and courage, qualities he had ample opportunity to demonstrate personally, but chose not to. This contradiction was not lost on the Hollywood community of the era. Director John Ford, who helped launch Wayne's career and directed him in numerous classics, reportedly referred to Wayne as phony brave, behind his back Ford, who served in the Navy during World War II and was wounded at the Battle of Midway, maintained a complex relationship with Wayne that was colored by this fundamental disconnect between image and reality. Ford respected Wayne's talents as an actor, but there was always this undercurrent of something like contempt, revealed a camera operator who worked with both men on multiple films. After a few drinks, Ford would sometimes make cutting remarks about how convincing Wayne was playing soldiers. When the real soldiers were off dying overseas, Wayne would just take it, because what could he say? They both knew the truth. This disconnect between public image and private reality extended to Wayne's much vaunted outdoor skills. Despite building his reputation, playing rugged frontiersmen, accomplished horsemen, and wilderness survivors, the real Wayne had limited experience with many of the skills his characters displayed with such apparent mastery. He wasn't a particularly good horseman, admitted a wrangler who worked on several Wayne westerns. He improved over the years through sheer necessity, but early in his career, we had to be really careful about which horses we gave him and which camera angles were used. What looked effortless on screen was often the result of careful editing and patient animal handlers just out of frame. Even Wayne's signature walk, that distinctive, slightly rolling gait that became one of his most recognizable characteristics, was not a natural attribute, but a calculated affectation developed specifically for his screen persona. The Wayne walk was something he consciously practiced, revealed actress Maureen O'Hara in a later interview. Early in his career, he studied the way certain directors wanted him to move, and he worked on it until it became second nature, but it wasn't his natural way of moving. It was a performance element that eventually became inseparable from his public identity. Perhaps most revealing was the gap between Wayne's on-screen fearlessness and what some colleagues described as a private hesitancy when faced with actual physical challenges. Stunt coordinator Chuck Robertson, who worked with Wayne for decades, noted in his memoir that Wayne talked tough, but he wasn't eager to take falls or do anything that might actually hurt. He'd make a big show about wanting to do his own stunts for the press, but once the reporters left, he was happy to let the professionals handle the dangerous stuff. This carefully constructed image was maintained through an elaborate system of publicity, selective storytelling, and the deliberate mythologizing of Wayne's life story. Studio publicists worked overtime to promote stories that reinforced his heroic image while systematically burying information that contradicted it. It wasn't just about hiding unflattering truths, explained entertainment journalist Margaret Wilson. It was about actively creating an alternate reality around a marketable persona. And John Wayne wasn't just complicit in this deception, he became its most dedicated performer, embodying the character of John Wayne so completely that the line between actor and role eventually disappeared, even for him. By the time Wayne had reached the height of his fame in the 1950s and 1960s, the manufactured image had become so pervasive and powerful that questioning it was tantamount to questioning America itself. Wayne had transformed from mere movie star to cultural icon, a symbol of national values that millions of Americans invested with almost religious significance. That's what made the deception so effective and so problematic, noted cultural historian James Reynolds. When you elevate a carefully constructed studio fabrication to the level of national symbol, you're not just selling movie tickets, you're selling a vision of American identity that may be built on fundamental untruths.
Sherry was right. You're soft. You should have let him kill me, 'cause I'm gonna kill you.
The hidden hatred, secret racism that Hollywood tried to bury. While John Wayne's avoidance of military service represented a significant contradiction between his public image and private reality, an even more disturbing aspect of his true character emerged in 1971 when an interview with Playboy magazine captured views that stood in stark contrast to the fair-minded, honorable hero he portrayed on screen. When asked about social issues, Wayne expressed opinions that shocked even some of his supporters, stating bluntly, I believe in white supremacy until the blacks are educated to a point of responsibility. I don't believe in giving authority and positions of leadership and judgment to irresponsible people. This wasn't a misquote or a moment taken out of context. Throughout the lengthy interview, Wayne doubled down on racist and homophobic views, expressing contempt for Native Americans. I don't feel we did wrong in taking this great country away from them. There were great numbers of people who needed new land, and the Indians were selfishly trying to keep it for themselves, and dismissing concerns about equality and representation in Hollywood. That interview was like a bomb going off in the studio executive offices, recalled a publicist who worked at Warner Brothers during this period. There was immediate panic about how to contain the damage. Here was their biggest star, openly expressing views that contradicted everything his heroic screen characters supposedly stood for. What's particularly revealing isn't just that Wayne held these views, but how Hollywood responded to their public exposure. Rather than addressing the contradiction between Wayne's professed beliefs and his heroic image, the studio system mobilized to minimize, contextualize, and eventually bury the controversy. The strategy was multi-layered, explained media historian Thomas Harrington. First, they limited the interview's circulation as much as possible, ensuring it didn't receive wider coverage in more mainstream publications. Then they deployed friendly journalists to write pieces emphasizing Wayne's on-screen contributions while dismissing the interview as unimportant. Finally, they flooded the market with positive Wayne stories to drown out the negative. This strategy proved remarkably effective. Despite expressing views that would likely have ended most careers, Wayne continued to be cast as heroic figures and maintained his position as one of Hollywood's most bankable and beloved stars. More importantly, the interview, despite being in print and undeniable, faded from public consciousness with remarkable speed. It was one of the most successful examples of cultural memory manipulation I've ever studied, noted Harrington. Within a year, you could mention John Wayne to the average American, and they would immediately think of his heroic roles, his patriotism, his larger-than-life persona, but not his explicit statements supporting white supremacy. The interview was effectively erased from the public narrative. This erasure wasn't accidental. It was the result of a deliberate and coordinated effort to preserve both Wayne's marketability and the powerful cultural mythology that had been built around him. Studio executives recognized that Wayne had transcended being merely an actor to become a symbol of American values, and they were unwilling to allow his actual views to contaminate that valuable cultural property. More troubling were the revelations from those who worked closely with Wayne that the Playboy interview wasn't an aberration or a misrepresentation, but rather an unguarded moment where the carefully maintained facade briefly dropped. Those weren't new opinions he suddenly developed for that interview, confided a crew member who worked on several Wayne films in the 1960s. Anyone who spent time around him when cameras weren't rolling and journalists weren't present knew exactly where he stood on race. He was just usually more careful about expressing those views publicly. Several Native American actors who appeared in Wayne's westerns later spoke about the uncomfortable atmosphere they experienced on his sets, where the disconnect between the scripted respect his characters sometimes showed for indigenous people and his actual attitude created a palpable tension. He would follow the script and deliver lines about respecting brave warriors, recalled one actor who appeared in 2 Wayne westerns but requested anonymity. But between takes, the way he talked about natives made it clear he didn't see us as equals. There was always this underlying message that we should be grateful to be included at all. In the decades following Wayne's death in 1979, Hollywood continued to protect and burnish his legacy, focusing celebrations of his work on his cinematic achievements while systematically downplaying or ignoring the controversial aspects of his personal beliefs. From TV retrospectives to museum exhibitions, the authorized version of Wayne's life story remained remarkably consistent and consistently sanitized. The cowboy hat didn't just hide his hair, it hid his views, noted cultural critic Richard Simmons. What's most revealing about the whole situation is that even after Wayne was gone, the machinery that maintained his myth continued operating. Too much cultural and financial capital was invested in John Wayne the symbol to allow John Wayne the man to complicate that narrative. This careful management of Wayne's legacy points to something more significant than just one actor's problematic views. It reveals how the entertainment industry has historically prioritized marketable mythology over uncomfortable truths especially when those truths might force audiences to reconsider their attachment to beloved cultural icons. Wayne's case is particularly significant because his image was so explicitly tied to American values and identity, explained cultural historian Eleanor Winters. When you construct a national hero whose private views include explicit white supremacy, what happens when those views come to light isn't just about one man's reputation, it's about confronting the uncomfortable contradictions in our national mythologies.
Under the wide, starry sky, take the grave.
The silent killer. His lung cancer was covered up for years. By the mid-1960s, John Wayne had reached the pinnacle of Hollywood success. His distinctive walk, talk, and screen presence had made him not just a star, but an American institution. His films consistently performed at the box office, and his personal brand of rugged individualism had become inextricably linked with the American national character. It was at this career high point, in 1964, that Wayne received devastating news that would be carefully hidden from the public for years. He had lung cancer. The initial diagnosis was treated like a state secret, recalled a production assistant who worked at Bat Jack Wayne's production company. Only his immediate family and a handful of top executives knew the full truth. Everyone else was told he was having minor health issues that would require a short break in filming. What makes this concealment particularly significant is that Wayne's cancer wasn't simply a private health matter, it was directly connected to the carefully constructed image that had made him a star. The Duke's heavy smoking wasn't incidental to his persona, it was an integral part of his on-screen identity. Countless iconic Wayne scenes featured him with a cigarette or cigar, the smoke wreathing his face as he delivered tough guy dialogue. Cigarettes were part of the Wayne brand, explained film historian Robert Thompson. They signified ruggedness, nonchalance toward danger, a certain masculine indifference to health concerns that matched his characters perfectly. To admit that this very behavior had now endangered his life would have undercut the invincible persona that sold so many movie tickets. Rather than use his diagnosis as an opportunity to warn others about the dangers of smoking, a step that could have saved countless lives given his enormous influence, Wayne and his team decided to minimize the seriousness of his condition and continue promoting an image of uncompromised health and vigor. After his surgery in 1964, the public was told he had a growth removed from his lung, noted medical historian Dr. Sarah Jenkins. The word cancer was deliberately avoided in press releases, and there was significant pressure on medical staff to maintain this fiction. Meanwhile, an entire lobe of his left lung, along with 4 ribs, had been removed in a procedure that was far more serious than fans were led to believe. Even more troubling than the initial concealment was Wayne's decision to continue promoting cigarette use through his films and public appearances after his diagnosis and surgery. Despite personally experiencing the devastating consequences of tobacco use, Wayne returned to smoking, both on and off screen, remarkably quickly after his recovery. He was back smoking on set within months of the surgery, confirmed a lighting technician who worked on several post-1964 Wayne films, not just as part of scenes, but constantly between takes. When one of the younger crew members gently suggested that might not be wise given his recent health scare, Wayne dismissed him with something like, "When I need medical advice from a grip, I'll let you know." This decision affected more than just Wayne's personal health. Film sets in the 1960s lacked modern ventilation systems or regulations about smoking, meaning that Wayne's renewed habit exposed cast and crew to significant secondhand smoke, a risk that was already understood by medical professionals at the time. It was like working in a chimney, recalled one makeup artist. He'd have that cigarette going constantly in his trailer during touch-ups, in restricted spaces during blocking rehearsals, everywhere. Some crew members with asthma or other respiratory issues really suffered, but nobody dared say anything. He was John Wayne. You didn't tell him to put out his cigarette. The effort to conceal the seriousness of Wayne's condition extended beyond just avoiding the word cancer. According to those involved with his films during this period, shooting schedules were quietly modified to accommodate his decreased stamina, camera angles were adjusted to mask his weight loss, and scripts were revised to reduce physically demanding scenes. "We were under strict instructions never to mention any changes or accommodations we were making," said a former assistant director. "If anyone asked why a scene was being simplified or a stunt doubled, we had prepared explanations that had nothing to do with his health. It was all about maintaining the illusion that the Duke was as strong and vital as ever." This illusion was so successfully maintained that many fans remained completely unaware of Wayne's 1964 cancer diagnosis until decades later. The careful image management continued even as the cancer eventually returned, with Wayne continuing to project strength and vitality in public appearances while privately dealing with increasingly serious health challenges. He didn't just light cigarettes, he lit a time bomb in his own chest, noted Dr. Jenkins. And when that bomb finally went off, the same publicity machine that had hidden the initial diagnosis went into overdrive to control how the public perceived his decline. The full extent of the cover-up only became clear years after Wayne's death, when members of his medical team and inner circle began sharing details of how systematically his health struggles had been concealed from the public. What emerged was a picture not just of personal privacy, but of a deliberate campaign to protect a valuable commercial image at the potential cost of public health education. Wayne had an opportunity to transform his diagnosis into a powerful warning about the dangers of smoking, reflected Dr. Jenkins. Given his enormous influence, especially among American men who were smoking at record rates in that era, he could have saved countless lives by being honest about his condition. Instead, he chose to protect the myth of the indestructible cowboy, continuing to model the very behavior that was killing him. This decision represents perhaps one of the most troubling aspects of the gap between Wayne's public image and private reality, a case where maintaining the fiction came with potential consequences for others who modeled their behavior on a carefully constructed falsehood.
There are probably only 10 parts of any size during the year. And
The bullying Duke, accusations of on-set abuse and intimidation. Behind the cameras, away from the adoring public, a very different John Wayne emerged, one whose behavior toward colleagues, particularly women and younger actors, stands in stark contrast to the honorable, fair-minded heroes he portrayed on screen. Working with Duke was like walking through a minefield, revealed an actress who appeared in 3 Wayne films in the 1950s, but requested anonymity even decades later. One day he'd be charming and avuncular, the next he'd humiliate you in front of the entire crew if you missed a mark or flubbed a line. There was no predicting which Duke would show up on set. This volatile unpredictability created an atmosphere of tension on many Wayne productions, with cast and crew often adjusting their own behavior to accommodate his moods and preferences. Junior actors reported being particularly vulnerable to Wayne's intimidation tactics, which many interpreted as deliberate efforts to establish dominance on set. When I was cast opposite him in my first major role, I was absolutely thrilled, recalled actor Michael Anderson Jr., who worked with Wayne as a young performer. That excitement lasted until the first day of rehearsal, when he interrupted me mid-line to tell me I acted like a goddamn schoolgirl and needed to find some balls if I wanted to share the frame with him. He did this in front of everyone, and nobody said a word. I was mortified, but I quickly learned this was how he established the pecking order. Numerous accounts from Wayne sets describe similar patterns of behavior: public criticism, condescending remarks, and deliberate undermining that went far beyond normal direction or constructive feedback. Women in particular seem to bear the brunt of Wayne's controlling tendencies. Maureen O'Hara, one of the few actresses who worked repeatedly with Wayne and earned his professional respect, nonetheless acknowledged the difficulties of their on-set relationship. Though she developed strategies for standing her ground, she witnessed his treatment of others who lacked her stature or assertiveness. Duke respected strength and despised what he perceived as weakness, O'Hara noted in a later interview. I gave as good as I got, so we developed a functioning relationship, but I saw how he treated younger actresses who were intimidated by him, and it wasn't pretty. He seemed to enjoy watching them squirm. One particularly troubling aspect of Wayne's on-set behavior was his apparent need to control every aspect of production when he was the star. Regardless of who was officially directing, multiple directors reported that Wayne would undermine their authority, question their choices, and sometimes even redirect scenes when he disagreed with their approach. He acted like the set was his saloon, and everyone else worked for the bartender, remarked a veteran cinematographer who worked on several Wayne westerns. Directors with strong personalities like John Ford or Howard Hawks could keep him in check, but less established filmmakers often found themselves essentially surrendering control of their pictures to Wayne's demands. For actors accustomed to collaborative creative environments, working with Wayne often came as a shock. His approach to filmmaking was hierarchical and rigid, with little room for experimentation or input from those he considered subordinate, which included virtually everyone except a small circle of longtime collaborators and a few directors he respected. He had very fixed ideas about how scenes should play, how dialogue should be delivered, even how other actors should stand or move in relation to him, said character actor Harry Carey Jr., who appeared in multiple films with Wayne. If you suggested an alternative approach, he'd look at you like you'd lost your mind. There was his way, and then there was the wrong way. This controlling behavior extended beyond creative decisions to personal conduct as well. Wayne reportedly felt entitled to comment on everything from an actress's weight or appearance to another actor's personal life or political views. Those who didn't conform to his expectations often found themselves subject to cutting remarks delivered in front of the entire company. He once stopped a scene to tell me I'd gotten too fat since last week and should lay off the craft services table, remembered an actress who worked with Wayne in the 1960s. I hadn't gained any weight. I was wearing different costuming with a different silhouette, but he felt perfectly entitled to publicly comment on my body, and nobody, including the director, said a word in my defense. Wayne's treatment of crew members revealed similar patterns of domineering behavior, with different standards applied depending on his personal assessment of their value. Technicians he respected, usually older men with extensive experience, were treated with collegial regard, while those he considered expendable could become targets for public humiliation over minor issues. He fired a young production assistant on the spot because the coffee delivered to his trailer was too damn hot, recalled a script supervisor, not sent back to the craft services area, not reassigned, fired completely, escorted off the set, unable to list the film on his resume, over coffee temperature. That's the kind of arbitrary power he exercised, and nobody questioned it. What made this behavior particularly noteworthy was its stark contrast with the principled, fair-minded characters Wayne portrayed on screen. His most famous roles often featured him defending the weak against bullies, standing up for justice regardless of personal cost, and treating others with a rough but fundamentally decent respect. The real Wayne, according to many who worked with him, demonstrated few of these qualities when real power dynamics were in play. He played heroes who would give the shirt off their back to help someone in need, noted one longtime crew member. But I once saw him refuse to delay a lunch break by 10 minutes when it meant a group of background actors, including elderly performers, had to stay in the hot sun because the shade structure was being relocated during the break. Those small moments of casual disregard for others revealed the man behind the myth. Not everyone who worked with Wayne reported negative experiences. Some actors, particularly those who shared his conservative politics and masculine self-presentation, described him as generous, supportive, and loyal. This selective treatment underscores what many observed about Wayne, that his behavior varied dramatically depending on whether he viewed someone as part of his in-group or as an outsider. If he liked you, which usually meant you were a certain type of man who reflected values he approved of, he could be the most generous, supportive colleague imaginable, said actor Ben Johnson, who appeared in several films with Wayne. But if you weren't in that favored circle, working with him could be hell, and most women, by definition, were excluded from that inner circle. This pattern of behavior wasn't just a matter of personal style or old-fashioned management. It represented a fundamental contradiction of the values Wayne claimed to represent both on screen and in his public statements. For an actor whose career was built on portraying men of principle and integrity, these behind-the-scenes realities point to one of the most significant gaps between image and reality in Hollywood history.
Under the wide, starry sky, dig the grave.
The political enforcer, the CIA connection no one talks about. One of the most controversial and carefully guarded chapters of John Wayne's life involves his alleged collaboration with government intelligence agencies during the McCarthy era, when Hollywood became a primary target in America's anti-communist crusade. While Wayne publicly positioned himself as a patriotic American standing against the communist threat, recently declassified documents and testimony from former colleagues suggest his involvement went far beyond mere political advocacy. According to multiple sources, Wayne actively assisted federal agencies in identifying suspected communist sympathizers within the film industry, effectively helping to destroy the careers of fellow artists while maintaining plausible deniability about his role. Wayne wasn't just talking about patriotism on screen. He was actively working to purge Hollywood of people he considered politically dangerous, asserted film historian Edward Mitchell, who has extensively researched the Hollywood blacklist period, the evidence suggests he functioned as something of an unofficial liaison between certain government operations and the studio system, identifying potential targets and applying pressure where needed. This alleged collaboration reportedly began in the late 1940s, when the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, launched its investigation into communist influence in Hollywood. As president of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals from 1949 to 1953, Wayne had a prominent public platform for his anti-communist views, but according to declassified FBI documents, his involvement went beyond public statements. The Bureau maintained extensive contact with Redacted, who provided information on suspected communist sympathizers within the motion picture industry, reads one partially declassified memo from 1951. While Wayne's name is among those redacted in the publicly available versions of these documents, several former FBI employees have confirmed he was one of the reliable industry sources referenced in multiple reports. What makes these allegations particularly troubling is the contrast between Wayne's public denials of involvement in blacklisting and the evidence suggesting a more active role. In public interviews, Wayne consistently portrayed himself as someone who opposed communism ideologically but respected others' right to their political views. "I don't believe in blacklisting," Wayne told Playboy in that same 1971 interview. "I think we should be taking names and calling them up in front of the public." Yet according to several colleagues who worked in Hollywood during this period, Wayne's private actions told a different story. Director and producer Vincent Sherman, who found himself gray-listed, not officially blacklisted, but finding work increasingly difficult to secure during this era, later claimed that Wayne had personally intervened to have him removed from a project at Republic Pictures. "I was set to direct a picture there in 1952. Sherman recalled in a 1990s interview. "Everything was approved, contracts were being drawn up, then suddenly I was told the project was going in a different direction." Years later, a producer who'd been at Republic told me Wayne had made a phone call saying I was politically unreliable. That was all it took. I didn't work again for almost 3 years. Similar accounts from others who found themselves suddenly unemployable during this period point to Wayne as one of several powerful industry figures who could effectively end careers with a word or a phone call, all while maintaining public deniability about their involvement in the blacklisting system. What made Wayne's alleged role particularly effective was his careful approach to these activities. Unlike some more visible anti-communist crusaders who publicly named names or made explicit accusations, Wayne reportedly operated more discreetly, raising concerns in private conversations with studio executives, suggesting certain writers or directors might create public relations problems, or simply making it known that he wouldn't work with particular individuals. "He was smart enough to leave no fingerprints," noted Mitchell. "He didn't need to testify or make public accusations. A word from John Wayne to the right studio executive was enough to raise questions about someone's employability, and in that era, mere questions about political loyalty were enough to end a career." The human cost of these activities was enormous. Hundreds of talented artists, writers, directors, actors, and technicians found themselves unable to work in their chosen profession, often for nothing more than attending the wrong meeting years earlier or signing a petition supporting a progressive cause. Many never recovered professionally, their careers and livelihoods permanently destroyed. "Wayne fought communism by helping destroy careers," remarked screenwriter Walter Bernstein, who was blacklisted for 8 years. And the irony is that most of the people targeted weren't actually communists at all. They were simply progressives, anti-fascists, people who believed in racial equality or labor rights. The real crime for many of us was simply not conforming to a narrow definition of Americanism that people like Wayne were enforcing. This chapter of Wayne's life represents perhaps the most significant contradiction between his public image as a defender of American values and the reality of his actions. While his characters fought for justice and stood against oppression, the real Wayne allegedly participated in a system that deprived fellow Americans of their livelihoods based on political beliefs, a fundamental violation of the very freedoms his screen persona claimed to defend. What's most troubling about Wayne's involvement isn't just the activities themselves, but the hypocrisy they represent, observed Mitchell. Here was a man who built his career playing characters who stood up for the little guy against powerful forces, who defended individual rights against tyranny. yet in real life, he reportedly used his considerable influence to support a system that punished people for their thoughts and association, the very definition of tyranny his characters would have opposed. As with other aspects of Wayne's life that contradicted his carefully constructed image, these allegations about his role during the Blacklist era have been systematically downplayed or omitted from official celebrations of his legacy museum exhibitions, television retrospectives, and authorized biographies typically mention his anti-communist views only in passing, framing them as simple patriotism rather than exploring the real-world consequences of how he allegedly put those views into action. It's another example of how the machinery of myth-making continues to protect the Wayne image even decades after his death, noted cultural critic Eleanor Winters. We're comfortable acknowledging that he was a patriot or a conservative, but not that he may have actively participated in one of the most shameful episodes of political repression in American cultural history.
And when you get that, that more or less ensures a nomination, because
The Fallen Cowboy. His final days were nothing like the man he played. For decades, John Wayne represented a particular vision of American masculinity, stoic, strong, and unflinching in the face of adversity. His characters typically faced death with dignity and resolve, often standing tall until the very end, even when mortally wounded. This carefully crafted image of dignified strength in the face of mortality became an integral part of the Wayne mythology. The reality of his final days, however, stood in stark and painful contrast to this cinematic ideal. According to those who were present during Wayne's last weeks in 1979, his death from stomach cancer was protracted, agonizing, and marked by a physical and emotional vulnerability entirely absent from his screen persona. The John Wayne America loved never would have allowed himself to be seen as he actually was at the end, confided a nurse who was part of the medical team during his final hospitalization at UCLA Medical Center. The difference between how his characters died in films and how he actually died was heartbreaking. Not because one was better than the other, but because he seemed so unprepared for the reality of his own mortality. By the time Wayne entered the hospital for the final time in May 1979, cancer had spread throughout his body. Despite having survived the 1964 lung cancer, he had developed stomach cancer that had metastasized extensively. His 6'4" frame, once powerful and imposing, had withered to around 160 pounds, leaving him almost unrecognizable to those who hadn't seen him in recent months. He looked like a completely different person, recalled a longtime friend who visited during those final weeks. The physical transformation was shocking, but even more disturbing was seeing his legendary confidence and self-assurance completely stripped away. He seemed confused much of the time, vulnerable in a way that would have horrified the younger Duke. Unlike his screen characters, who typically faced death with stoic resolve and minimal medical intervention, the real Wayne spent his final days dependent on complex medical support, including feeding tubes, oxygen, and powerful medications that left him drifting in and out of lucidity. The cowboy who had famously refused help even when wounded in countless films now required assistance for the most basic functions. He couldn't eat, could barely speak above a whisper, and needed help even to shift position in bed, the nurse revealed. For a man whose entire identity was built around self-sufficiency and physical power, this dependency seemed to cause as much suffering as the cancer itself. You could see the humiliation in his eyes when he needed help with basic bodily functions. Perhaps most poignantly, those close to Wayne during this period reported moments of startling vulnerability when the carefully maintained facade completely fell away, revealing regrets and fears that stood in stark contrast to the untroubled confidence of his public persona. During one of his more lucid periods about a week before he passed, he grabbed my hand and said, "It's all gone too fast. There should have been more time," remembered a family friend who was present during some of Wayne's final days. There was a fear in his eyes I'd never seen before, not just fear of dying, but almost a realization that he'd spent his life playing a character that had little to do with who he really was or what actually mattered. This theme of regret emerged repeatedly in accounts from those present during Wayne's final decline. Unlike the screen characters who typically died with a sense of completion or sacrifice for a worthy cause, the real Wayne apparently struggled with a sense of unfinished business and missed opportunities. He talked about his children, about wishing he'd been more present, the nurse recalled, about how making movies about life isn't the same as living it, These weren't just medication-induced ramblings. They seemed like genuine realizations coming from a man suddenly confronting the gap between the hero he'd portrayed and the human being he actually was. Wayne's religious views, which had never featured prominently in his public image, also became more evident during his final days. Having converted to Roman Catholicism shortly before his death, he reportedly found both comfort and new uncertainty in facing mortality through this spiritual lens. He received last rites which seemed to bring him some peace, said another medical professional who was present, but he also expressed doubt, wondering if he'd lived the right way, if the values he'd promoted on screen were the ones that actually mattered. In the end, these existential questions seemed to trouble him deeply. The stark contrast between Wayne's actual death and the dignified ends his characters typically face points to perhaps the most fundamental disconnect between the man and the myth. In film after film, Wayne portrayed men who lived and died by a clear moral code, facing their ends with certainty and often imparting wisdom with their final breaths. The real Wayne, by contrast, died questioning his choices, dependent on others, and struggling with fears and regrets that never appeared in his carefully crafted screen persona. The Duke died quietly, nothing like the hero fans imagined, observed his attending physician, who later spoke about the experience on condition of anonymity. There were no profound last words, no standing tall in the face of death. In the end, he was just a suffering human being, like any other, frightened, in pain, and largely helpless against the disease consuming him. This reality was carefully shielded from the public at the time. Media reports about Wayne's condition were heavily sanitized, emphasizing his courage and fighting spirit, while omitting the physical and emotional realities of his decline. After his death on June 11, 1979, official statements focused on his legacy as an American icon rather than the difficult details of his final days. The public was given the John Wayne death they expected: dignity, bravery, stoicism, noted media historian Thomas Harrington. The reality was deliberately obscured because it contradicted everything the Wayne mythology represented. A vulnerable, frightened, regretful Wayne wasn't marketable, even in death. This final act of image management, controlling the narrative of Wayne's death to align with his screen persona rather than his lived reality, represents the culmination of a lifelong pattern of manufacturing and maintaining a marketable myth at the expense of human truth. In life, in death, and even decades after, the machinery of the John Wayne image continues operating, observed cultural historian Eleanor Winters. The gap between the cowboy hero and the dying man in that hospital bed may be the most honest measure of how completely Hollywood can transform a human being into a product, and how difficult it becomes to separate the two, even at the very end.